Hello everyone. So today I'm going to talk about natural selection. Really what we're focusing on this week, it seems, is how does Darwin explain his revolutionary theory? And this begins with his book, The Origin of Species. The introduction is pretty important because I think it gives us a good look into Darwin's mindset and what kind of place he was in when he was writing this book. And specifically, the introduction focuses a lot on why Darwin publishes now rather than later, when he felt that his theory might have been more fully formed. His health was failing, and he had a friend, Alfred Wallace, that had sent a letter detailing that he thinks he had come across this really interesting theory. It wasn't as formed as Darwin's, but basically someone was coming up with the same idea that Darwin had been working on for the past few years, and he was like, oh no, if I don't get this out there, someone's going to come up with and fully publish this theory before I am able to, and all my work won't have been wasted, but he wouldn't have gotten the credit for thinking of it first. So in chapter 1, Darwin sets out and he just basically rejects the kind of widely held belief that habits of use were the main mode of variation. He also rejected the idea that most species must have descended from multiple parent species, and he says that they more likely descended from one parent species. To illustrate this idea, he specifically talks about the pigeons. Even though they seem quite different, underneath they're all very similar and likely came from one parent species, rather than breeders who thought they came from multiple parent species. Heredity, i.e., inherited characteristics, are the key to explaining variation. In chapter 2, Darwin goes into explaining the difference between varieties, species, and genera. So his ideas contradict the widely held belief that God created each species independently. And this is really important because it goes back to what happened in the previous chapter where he talks about the pigeons and how breeders believe that they came from multiple parent species rather than one. Darwin's initial problem with debunking the idea that God had created each species independently was the fact that there was no way to differentiate varieties from species. What is the greatest amount of variety that can be tolerated in a species before it becomes another species? Darwin tries to clarify this by saying that the difference between species must be greater than the difference between varieties. While that's somewhat helpful for his argument, it really doesn't put the issue to rest. In chapter 3, Darwin talks about the struggle for existence. So he says that the struggle for existence determines why some characteristics survive and why some become extinct. He talks about nature in the idea that it's both necessary and life-giving for species, but also that it's destructive to the species that it supports. This destructiveness is compounded by the fact that nature limits the number of possible inhabitants in each environment. And Darwin goes on to say that the most important struggle is the struggle between members of one species, because that determines which characteristics gets passed on to the next generation. This is one important quote that I think really reflects what's happening. When we reflect on this struggle, we may console ourselves with the full belief that the war of nature is not incessant, that no fear is felt, that death is generally prompt, and that the vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply. Now finally, in chapter 4, Darwin gets to his theory of natural selection. So he goes on to say that nature has the power to select variations that are only perceptible to species themselves. This kind of goes back to the idea, the principles of geology, that the changes happen over time, over lifetime. So it's not perceptible to the people in which the change is occurring, but it's perceptible over multiple lifetimes. Darwin then goes on to say that sexual selection ensures that males with the best characteristics favorable to finding a mate perpetuate those characteristics because they're chosen by females. The combination of these two things leads to the gradual creation of new species. Some lingering questions that I have are, how can the difference between varieties and species be better explained? Clearly, Darwin does his best to kind of stave off extensive criticism in that area, but his theory is far from complete. In addition, I'm kind of curious, how much did Darwin's characterization of sexual selection reinforce patriarchal ideals? Specifically because Darwin seems to forget the fact that in addition to the male part of reproduction, there is clearly the female part of reproduction. So therefore, female characteristics must also in some way be important to the equation. I hope that this video was helpful to everyone and that we have a great discussion on Thursday.